My name is, gotcha. Hello, everybody. My name is Ann Fiddler. I work at the City University of New York, and I am the OER librarian. I run the OER initiatives across the City University of New York, which is crosses the 5 boroughs of New York City, and we have 24 campuses and 500,000 students that we educate. And OER is a heart project at CUNY, and so here we are. Rebecca?
Good afternoon, I'm Rebecca Karoff. I'm an Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs in the University of Texas system, and I work on all things student success and have taken the lead on helping build momentum and capacity around OER across our 8 academic universities. Our system serves about 240,000 students. We also have 5 health institutions. Really pleased to be here. Thank you so much.
So the Doers Group stands for Driving OER for Student Success and some other S things, which I can't remember off the top of my head. But what happened was back in 2016, City University of New York had been involved in a bunch of OER projects, one of which was the Achieving the Dream project, which was to create an associate's degree pathway with OER in the community colleges. And so we had 3 of our colleges involved. And a few months into the project, it got the notice of New York State. And New York State basically came calling and said, we would like to fund OER. And we said, great. And they said, write us a proposal. So we said, okay, it was like emergency, write a proposal. We want to talk to you at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And so we got together, a couple of us who had been working on this, and we decided to over ask for money, and we asked for $1 million a year for the next 4 years. And we sent off our proposal, and that was it. It was the new budget cycle at the end of March, and the new budget was going to be announced in April. So we kind of forgot about it. And then all of a sudden, New York State came back and said, well, here you go. Here's $4 million. Go and spend it in a year. Do OER. No parameters, nothing. So we got $4 million and SUNY got $4 million, which is our state counterpart, the State University of New York. And so we put our heads together and said, okay, what are we going to do now? And it was really the first, in my experience with OER at the time, it was, the first time that we really had access to a lot of impact in the coming year. And so University of Maryland came calling and said, I hear you got some OER money. And MJ Bishop, who runs she's an associate vice chancellor there, and she's runs their Center for Student Success. And she came calling and said, we should really get together and talk about this. And so we did. And we basically said, what would be the benefit of us collaborating together? And so the benefit of it was that we could throw our weight around as systems and sort of drive the conversation in a way that prevented people who preyed on such things, like publishers and people who used OER for and started charging for it because of their platform and things like that. So we wanted to drive the conversation. So we had a lot of conversations early on. This was back in 2016. And we basically started going out, we developed a statement of purpose, which you can see on our website. And basically it says the purpose is to position member organizations to realize the promise of high quality, accessible and sustainable OER implementations to achieve equity and student success at scale. So that was our basic intention. And over the course of the next few years, we were able to hire some help, more than just hired help, who helped us go out there and talk to other systems and see if they wanted to collaborate with us. And so basically that's what we did. So we ended up coordinating, collaborating with other, other nationwide efforts, and not just in the nation, but also in Canada as well. So at the moment, we have developed to represent 25 systems initiatives, representing 688 colleges and universities and over 6 million students. And this is a map of who we're representing. So over the years, as the systems came on board, we would continue to have meetings. And the last time we had a meeting in person, I believe, was in Texas in 2019. And that's when we really were a strong group. We were hosted very graciously by the University of Texas at Arlington, and we had a really amazing meeting. And at that time, we came up with sort of a plan of action. What were we going to do except for sit around and talk about how we're all doing OER, we're all going to share ideas, we're all going to try not to replicate things. And so we came up with with 3 working groups. So there's the 3 working groups are the research group. They do basically a landscape analysis or OER 101, what's happening in the nation and in Canada. And they also want to know, how does OER improve student success? So they came up with a research question, and in our various ways at our various campuses, we can help to answer these questions. For example, at CUNY, we have a very sharp Office of Institutional Research, and they collect data and we can analyze it. So we can look at, students who took algebra, intro to algebra before it was an OER course. Did students do better before, or did they do better after it was an OER course? I have to say that what we're finding at this moment is that there is no change. There is no better that we can really put our fingers on, but we can say that we did no harm, and we can say that we've saved students money and anxiety over spending money. So it's not a negative. We're hoping for more of a positive over time, but we're not quite there yet. The capacity building work group basically is talking about, sustainability of OER. And this is always the question that, campuses find. Yes, we have money now, but what about when the money runs out? How do we make this sustainable? So they've been working on a couple of things. They've come up with a tenure and promotion framework, which is basically, it's called the OER contributions matrix. And it questions and asks comment about how to reward OER in tenure and promotion. And again, you'll be able to find that matrix on our website. We hope that everybody will take a look at it, who's interested in it, share it with other people, and please give us your feedback, as we're going to ask for feedback in the work that we do. So we got lucky in the equity work group because we got Rebecca to be our leader, and she's been amazing. And so with her guidance and really an amazing, amazing group of members, we came up with this blueprint on the role of OER in closing equity gaps. So what role can OER play in advancing equity? And with that, we also came up with a rubric, which is what we're going to talk about here. So the blueprint defines, unpacks, and explains multiple dimensions of equity and the foreground role of OER in closing equity. And so basically there's a theoretical and research foundation, equity through OER rubric, and then there's case studies. I think we always were talking about equity, but I think when we started to talk about the rubric more specifically, I think we came up with, OER is equity. That's what it is. Of course it saves students money. Yes. And that's what brings everybody to the table. But then it brings so many more things, like we like to say at CUNY, come for the student savings and stay for the open pedagogy, because, so many of our faculty, and we have been fortunate to have so many people around the university, come together over this, have had such aha moments. And it's not just aha, I can save my students money, aha, we can have our students not, have their course materials first day of class, but it's also aha, suddenly there's a way of looking at your pedagogy through an open lens, which is very invigorating to our faculty. I'm not bored this year, is what we hear. Suddenly I'm interested in my students are interested in me. So, as we go forward and we have so much more, back in 2017, the first year that we had so much money to go around, we had to explain ourselves everywhere we went around the university. And then, by year 3, it was like, oh yeah, OER, everybody knows what OER is, and when you're talking about, such a huge student population of 500,000, imagine how many faculty we have as well. So it's been, incredibly gratifying on just so many different levels. So, this doers experience became really valuable to me because I got to, work with people like Rebecca and the other people in the work group and see what, what other work groups were doing. And that's where we're coming from. So the time is now for a lot of reasons. Okay, the time is now because we've done so much work, the race of OER has happened since 2016, 2017, and we've gotten where we are today, as they say very often in the OER world, building the plane while we're flying it. But we've got this fleet of planes now, and everybody's still building their plane while we're flying it. And so the time is now for that reason, because states are getting on board, the federal government is getting on board. People are giving money away. People are asking, what do you want money for? Back in 2017, it was like, who do we ask money from? Who do we ask for money? And now it's kind of like, we can tell you who to ask for money because people want to invest in this. It's an important investment. It has come to the surface. And the time is now because, well, COVID, right? Because everybody knows now, it's like all of a sudden, we had these great projects going on at our colleges, but, suddenly COVID hit and we were shut down literally overnight, as was everybody. And all of a sudden it was like, oh, that OER thing, that would have been a really good idea. And, the people who were prepared had done OER, they could make the transition smoothly. So, maybe COVID is ending. Maybe it's not ending as fast as people say, but in either case, we're not going back to the time before. We're going forward, and this is a perfect time for us to be expanding in this. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Anne. And this is, in some ways, it is sort of an understatement to say that the time is now, and the sort of third pillar of sort of why this work is so important right now is, I think, this country's really sort of, ongoing reckoning with race and racial injustice. And so this work that we're doing as part of the equity and OER blueprint, I think, could not be more timely. We do, and I always like to do in lots of projects that I work on around equity, we like to define equity, and I'll just share that definition with you now. It's on the slide. Life chances and choices are limited by many kinds of inequality, including social, income, racial, ethnic, gender, and ability. Equity is a corrective process that demands fairness for marginalized and minoritized populations by reducing gaps in opportunity and achievement through systemic efforts. I think, the work that we're doing in this project is really posits as well definitions of equity mindedness, and we use terminology like equity centeredness. So I do want to just sort of say that, what we're talking about is applying an equity lens in all its dimensions, and we want to unpack those dimensions broadly to not just OER, but to student success work writ large, and also to the ways in which higher education institutions organize themselves, allocate resources, work towards continuous improvement, and also hold themselves accountable. Next slide. The Doers Equity Work Group did establish a set of core values also on the screen here, and they're in our blueprint. The blueprint, as Anne had said, is there it has multiple components. It has the theoretical and research foundation. It has the equity through OER rubric, where we're going to focus on more closely in a minute. You're going a little fast.
I also forgot that I'm sharing my screen and I'm looking through the participants, so I apologize for that.
So, but I think one of the things that we are also hold as a core value is that equity doesn't happen without intentionality of purpose and action together. So, and I did want to just reference, my own, I mentioned that I was a student success person in the University of Texas system. And I've done some other national projects around equity, including a project through NASH, the National Association of System Heads, that's called the Equity Action Framework, and really looks at university systems and community college systems, any kind of higher education system, and thinks about how you can approach equity across a system, both system offices and institutions. But the other thing I think that just really has been important to me over the years is that we name, we claim, and we do equity. We name it, we define it, we sort of state it very publicly as we can, that it is a core value to the institution that we're a part of, and then we figure out ways to advance it. And I do want to recognize the role of the libraries. I think most people here are somehow library affiliated. You're in libraries. I'm obviously not, but I have the privilege of working with the library directors as a kind of liaison from the Office of Academic Affairs here at System with all the library deans and directors in the UT system. And it's been phenomenal what I've learned from them. In some ways, what I learned, first of all, I've just learned about libraries are just sort of what I would call hotbeds of student success activity. They're the locus of so much activity going on around student success, not just OER work, but sort of technology and innovation and tutoring centers and other kinds of academic support centers. And so I've just in some ways, when I came to the UT system, my eyes were opened up by the power of what librarians are doing, the locus of action and leadership around OER, and also equity that is taking place. And I do want to recognize the work of this organization, the ACRL, which is not a group I know well, but you have a real strong commitment to racial justice and resolving gaps in opportunity and attainment with that equity focus. And I really do want to just appreciate the kind of commitment you've all made through this organization and within your spheres of influence. Next slide. We actually go back. This is, sorry, Ann, you were there. I do also want to say, so as we move into the equity through OER rubric, Ann mentioned that we have this very committed work group and that we kind of got our start in late 2019, really just a few months before COVID hit. I do want to recognize Brittany Dudek, who's, you can maybe see her on the screen, but she's helping moderate the chat. She is a member of our work group. She's in the community college system, the Colorado Community College system, and she's been a great partner. So she's not taking a presentation role today, but she's very much a part of all the work that you're seeing presented. And then we also had members from a total of 6 university systems, or I say university, 6 post-secondary systems, and also a Department of Higher Education in Massachusetts. So, we had states like Massachusetts, New York, Georgia, New Hampshire, 2 Texas systems, and then Colorado. So not nationwide representation, but a pretty good cross-section of members. We had diversity in terms of racial and ethnic identities, as well as in terms of roles that we each play within our organizations. So next slide. So the Equity Through OER rubric is a tool for evaluating and improving equity in OER. It's really, so we have this blueprint, which has the sort of more theoretical and foundation and a fairly brief research overview, research that we know we want to build, as Ann talked about, in terms of doers as an organization, in terms of all of us working in this environment. But really the rubric is the application of the theoretical framework. In some ways, it's the centerpiece, it's the real heart of this project because it lays out and scaffolds where the action can and should happen. As you will leave you with a link to the rubric, and I do recommend that you kind of read the framing part of it as you kind of think about ways in which you may or may not want to engage. And then really, as you kind of jump in, you'll notice that, and we'll talk about each of these elements of the rubric, but you're trying to assess the scale of adoption. What stage are you at in terms of your OER or equity-minded engagement with OER? Who are your stakeholders? And we sort of name some stakeholders we think who need to both be represented in the work and who need to take active roles. And then how can you take action? And while the rubric is focused on sort of single institutions, we do think there's lots of opportunities for others to engage and use the rubric, including university system offices, including organizations maybe like this one, maybe like Arlo, maybe like WCT, others, and also SHIOs and departments of higher education. And there are multiple ways to engage with the rubric. The rubric developers, we really try to create a tool that would meet people where they are and that would invite educators in to use the rubric as a means to both recognize and honor their own commitment to equity, and also evaluate progress and act on those areas that really have been identified as needing additional focus and effort. And you also might use the rubric if you're not a whole university and you can't get your institution, or a whole college, you can't get your whole institution to focus on it. I think it could still, there'll be pieces here for units, for libraries, for bookstores, for information and instructional technology offices, for business affairs, for assessment offices, to sort of engage and find meaning and hopefully think about how they can make a difference. Next slide. So we have a scale of adoption. It's got multiple stages. You see not present, beginning, emerging, established. I won't sort of read closely what's in there, but what was kind of funny as we went along and had, at one point we had a 5th category of advanced, but as we were crafting the components of what would be established in terms of the different dimensions that are represented in the rubric, we were like, oh my gosh, if someone gets to established, you're way ahead. And a few of you might be there. CUNY and SUNY, maybe with all our resources, might be there in some ways. The UT system, some of our institutions are quite established. Many of them aren't yet because it's still nascent for some of our campuses, but we sort of just said, forget established, forget advanced. You know, if you're established, hats off, kudos to you, and the rest of us can be a little bit envious. Next slide. And then what we really did was to set out, as we said, we're trying to unpack the multiple dimensions of equity within OER. So we focused on 3 areas, 3 groups: students, practitioners, and leadership. And we each within that, there are 12 separate components, 12 dimensions in these 3 broad areas. We were striving for a kind of comprehensiveness. And in some ways, I think we achieved it. Some people will find this tool somewhat intimidating. But we also I just want to acknowledge that there's blind spots. There's blind spots in multiple ways in this work. Partly like maybe we don't include a unit, an office, a stakeholder group that really should be playing a more intentional role, that might be playing a role in some of your institutions and organizations. But we also know that you can't always you want to be inclusive in terms, especially in terms of student populations and other staff and faculty and others, administrators. You want to think about those populations of opportunity and identities and intersectional identities. And sometimes those were not always probably as well represented in the rubric as we want them to be. We did, as Ann kind of mentioned, I think we did want to draw out race and ethnicity as much as sort of lower income or low SES Pell eligible students. Obviously lowering costs, the affordability improvements that happened through OER, there's been a lot more attention there, but we think the racial piece, the race and ethnicity aspects of student demographics in particular needed to be named a little bit more intentionally. And we also, of course, brought in ability. And while there's actually some phenomenal work. I think some of you are probably creators of it, but lots of great work around accessibility in OER. I'm thinking of BC Campus in Georgia. So we felt that we needed to absolutely include that, and yet we also wanted to sort of be a little bit more intentional around the race ethnicity piece. And throughout the tool, the equity lens is embedded. It's embedded implicitly and explicitly, and what we hope is that those of you who engage with the rubric will start thinking more broadly about equity in ways that we don't always even give ourselves permission, let alone time to do. So, and I did want to say about the leadership, you see an asterisk on that slide, we're really, like we do carve out some attention to what administrators and decision makers, especially those who make decisions around budgets, what roles they have, how they are accountable. But we also want to sort of say that everybody has a leadership role to play in this work. Okay, Ann, did you want to add anything to this? I realize I should.
No, that's fine. The only thing I think what you had to say was great. I just want to point at, our attitude at CUNY, and I think that I'll just share it, which is that, this has to work both ways. It has to be grassroots up and it has to be top down. We are particularly sensitive at CUNY about being top down because we get a lot of resistance when we appear that way. But because it really did come at the same time, it was an easy thing, whether it was because it was the topic that, just speaks to everybody or whatever it was. I think there was just like a nice dovetail of, grassroots saying, we want this, and leadership saying, yeah, that's a great idea. So, that's why we sort of separate it this way.
And actually, I love that comment, Ann, because it's in some ways I've been involved in a lot of different kinds of change, what I call change work, from system offices here in Texas, previously in Wisconsin. And that's the only way you get change done if you're in a system office, is to have that percolation of, and that sort of meeting in the middle of the bottom up, top down kind of work where you come together and really collaborate on behalf of students in institutional success and effectiveness. Next slide. So we wanted to share a couple of sample pages, so-called pages on the rubric. It's obviously online. So this is one part of the practitioner's page on instruction and pedagogy. And this is actually, excitingly, in the OER world, there's, I think, a lot more attention being paid very particularly to pedagogy and the role of instructors in advancing equity through OER. This particular section calls out in some ways who among your instructors are doing OER. How are they identified? How are they included? And even the opportunity to sort of engage and build capacity around OER. How are they developed? How are they rewarded or not, as the case may be? And we do know that paying attention to the inclusiveness of instructors and instruction is a necessary condition to thinking about what's actually some other categories in our rubric, which are around content, both the quality of OER content, and for us, quality has to include sort of cultural relevance, responsiveness, and inclusiveness, as well as pedagogy. So those are additional sections, actually, as well as I meant content across the curriculum, as well as that piece around what's in the content. And did you want to say anything else about this one?
Sort of, I guess that, as I was saying earlier, instruction and pedagogy, it's really taken root there, starting with OER, and basically at a place like CUNY, and many of you who are on the call who may work for institutions that, deal with these kinds of populations, it's so glaring that that the materials that are assigned don't often reflect the population that is being taught. And so, it's a no-brainer, like it really unleashes this this possibility when you do look at it this way. I also want to comment on the fact that, what Rebecca said before about, if you're established, you're established. Well, if anyone's going to be established, it's going to be us, and we are not. So, I think that it's the journey, and that these are just sort of steps in the journey that we're pointing out to you, and we hope for feedback from you from this template as well. Take this and make it your own. Take this and give us feedback that we might be missing something that we might want to include, or that maybe we want to disclude something. So
great. I think you have the next one.
Okay, so for leadership, again, leadership and accountability. Again, I would consider us continually in a position of emerging. We have, we go from not present, which explains itself, to beginning, which is basically, thinking about it. How do we bring this in, to emerging, which is, again, I'm going to say it every time I look at this rubric, I kind of feel it in a different way a little bit, so like now I'm looking at it, like as I was reading through this to do this presentation, I'm thinking, yeah, we should be established, but yeah, we're really not, because we're constantly reevaluating ourselves, and so many issues come up as we go along. Assessment of OER, accessibility, these issues are constantly coming to light. Yes, we've got the cost savings to students down. We've got our return on investment formula down. We're still figuring out how to utilize the data that's available to us, and I think we'll always be trying to figure out how to utilize the data available to us. we hope for, some measure of student performance and success, progression through college faster, taking more credits per semester, those kinds of things. But, we have so much information that we're still, figuring that out. But these are, so again, these are points that you can take a look at and say, well, maybe these are some things that we should consider. Rebecca, anything?
Yeah, no, and you'll notice again, I appreciate Ann sort of saying that CUNY isn't quite established and they're sort of one of our role models here in the University of Texas system. But in some ways that getting to that comprehensive approach is really, really hard to do. And what you can't see on this particular slide, because the screen cuts off the bottom half, but like we are really thinking about the kinds of data we could be collecting in terms of ongoing assessment, both quantitative and qualitative. And one of the things that's not visible here, and that I don't think I've said yet, is that, and I think this is something that most of us know at this point, I hope, is you've got to disaggregate all your data by race, by ethnicity, by income, by gender, by age, by ability, if you can. Some of this data is harder to correct if you sort of some of our systems where you have huge divides between rural and urban, geography will play a role, that kind of thing. So, again, that assessment has to really take place in a very granular way, so that you're looking at the multiple outcomes across disaggregated populations. And so always that equity lens is just asking us to say, who's at the table, who's included, who isn't, who has access, who doesn't, who's succeeding, who isn't, and really try to go as fine-grained in terms of the analysis you're able to do. And there's also something that I hope is becoming somewhat clear. You're just getting little sort of snapshots of the rubric, but this is about broad support, the kind of infrastructure that would be needed, that you'd need to have in place to do the kind of holistic assessment, and that would allow for more equity-centered action. This is hard work, and it is true. We don't want anyone to be sort of scared away by this rubric, but we want to, again, sort of invite people in to say, we're doing some great things and we could do more, especially if we take that more holistic approach. The other thing that I need to mention is that this is also very, on some level, I want to acknowledge all the resource constraints that all of us have, and some of us have more than others. Most states aren't giving away a total of $8 million over multiple biennia to their two university systems. And of course, CUNY and SUNY are among the largest in the country, so it's phenomenal. But some of you work in very resource constrained environments. In fact, you probably all do, because you're library people, and libraries are notoriously under resourced. So I want to at least have a nod to that. Why don't we go to the next slide? So I do want to just share some real epiphanies of this work together that we've arrived at as an equity work group that's part of Doers, but also I think some of you are also coming up with these lessons, these epiphanies around OER. But I've said for years that that quality and equity are constituent components of one another, and I believed it, and never have I seen such a great sort of almost visual representation of that in this rubric. They are so intertwined, quality and equity, and if you're doing OER with that equity lens, you're doing OER really well. And if you're also just going to have such high levels of quality and integrity around what students need and what institutional effectiveness, how you might actually define it. And so while this is focused on OER, the truth is so many of your programs, when we talk about instruction and pedagogy, when we talk about student access to OER and technology, when we talk about what's the role of IT, what kind of staffing do you need, what kind of assessment infrastructure do you need to have in place? Well, if you can sort of even pay attention with that equity lens to the different dimensions and categories that are present in this rubric, you're going to have some high quality programming and infrastructure and supports for students and others at your institution that are in place that at the end of the day don't have to only be about OER. And then finally, the comprehensiveness is the point. Okay, so we don't want to sort of induce any shame or guilt for people if they find they're just in those early stages of adoption, but really evaluating where action and attention are absent is that necessary first step. And the holistic planning that's embedded in the rubric in these stages, as you hopefully move from one stage of adoption to the next, there is that emphasis on continuous improvement, on sustainability, on scaling. And it really, I think, provides a kind of blueprint for reaching equity. And one of the things about the comprehensiveness, you know, as I'm getting old here, so I've been doing this work for decades, and I've just been struck, like I've been focused on equity for several decades, and I'm both in awe of all the progress we've made. It's a beautiful thing, and yet also sort of horrified by where we haven't made progress. And if anything, COVID and the sort of the nation's you know, reckoning with race that's happened over the last 18 months, and we're, you know, we are not done with either of those things. I do feel like this rubric really helps us resist and refute low expectations that equity cannot be measured, number one, or that it can only be assessed, you know, only in terms of student outcomes, I think. And we also have a tendency, I think, in higher ed to sort of say, well, we're strong in this dimension, we can, of equity, we can declare victory and go home. But I do think, if anything explains why we haven't made more progress, it's because equity, you know, it's not a new conversation. It's because I think sometimes we get too content with minimal progress. We're okay with like singular, marginalized, compartmentalized engagement. And we sort of think of equity as that afterthought. And this rubric is just saying, no, let's take that more comprehensive, holistic view and look at ourselves in the mirror in the way we do our work, whatever your role is, and really think more deeply and holistically about equity. And you're on the next slide.
Okay, so there's more to the work that we have been doing. One thing I will say, look for hot off the presses new press books about the Doers Equity work group work that we've done. We plan to be publishing that with UT Arlington, University of Texas Arlington. Thank you, Texas. Shortly. So there'll be the blueprint, there will be the and we're going to be having case studies. So we also implore any of you who are willing to share case studies with us. We would love to have them. I, as CUNY, have not written one yet, but I would like to, and it is an intention of mine to do so. So we have Affordable Learning Georgia, which is really great. BC Campus, Ohio State, and they're all doing fantastic work in OER. And so we all look forward to sharing those stories with you and having more in our arsenal.
And we also have a project that we're just starting to work on. We're looking to formalize a cohort-based piloting of the equity through OER with several higher education partners across the United States. And we already have a couple of institutions that have heard us present in other fora on this work and who would like to be a part of that pilot, and some of our own equity work group members. I'm hoping I can get a couple of UT system institutions to want to pilot this. So we're looking to formalize what piloting would look like, what it might mean if we're really lucky. Well, we are going to look for funding. We think there's funding out there for something like this. We know there's a lot of interest, and participants will develop those comprehensive plans that will, if you're not at established, but you'll be able to develop a comprehensive plan for getting there, as well as we expect a deliverable of this project to be the creation of a case study, so we can build, as Ann said, that whole portfolio. Next, yeah, I think we're almost done here, and then we'll open it up for questions. Here's the Doers website, and I realize, okay, so we don't have but Brittany, you put the link in, I think, in the chat, right? So the link is in the chat, which is, oh, there we go. We do have the link here as well. So we encourage you to take a look at the blueprint and the rubric within the blueprint. It is open, as Ann mentioned. It's, you know, got a CC BY license, and we do anticipate and hope and expect that people will take this rubric and say, oh, this isn't quite work for my organization or institution, but if we adapt it in these ways, it'll work for us, or even take that subsection of it. We know that this is, again, that I say comprehensiveness and holistic approach is the point. I also know that we have to start somewhere. Next slide. Yeah, questions for people. And I'll look at the chat. Suddenly I know Brittany's been monitoring.
That was superb timing. Exactly what we were asked to do.
Excellent. We didn't rehearse. Invite people to either unmute, or if that's possible, or just put your question in the chat and we can take a look at it. Reactions too, doesn't have to be a question.
I'm going to put our contact information here for a little while, and then I'm going to stop sharing so I can peruse the participants list without sharing that with all of you.
So if you'd like to sort of follow up, okay, actually, Brittany, maybe I should let you do the chat because I'm going to get confused.
So the first question, how can we best communicate with you if we would like for our institution to link up with your OER efforts, particularly a new cohort?
Actually, I recommend that you email me, and I can put my email in the chat again, even though it's on that last slide. And again, we're just starting the process, but I would expect by fall we would have a project defined, hopefully funded. But even if not, I think that we have people interested in trying to think about how we do this, together. So I will say, you know, the doers, all the doers members we're all volunteers. We all have big day jobs. So sometimes everything takes us a little longer than we think, but yeah.
And then we also have, are there efforts being made to encourage LGBTQ OER content? It sounded like gender identity was included as a metric of diversity, so I was wondering. Thank you.
I love that question, Anna. You might know, again, we're not sort of creating any content per se. Well, individual members might be of the work group, but it's a great question. Yes, absolutely. Gender identity is included in the rubric. It's named, I believe. I'm trying to remember how much we actually named the different categories. But Ann, do you know anything about LGBTQ?
Well, you know, it's a big topic at CUNY, and we do encourage that. I know the questioner. Yes.
Does anyone know of anything? This might be a great, either put it in the chat or share what you're what you know about.
For the person who wrote the question, I think that I would also encourage you, based on the case studies that we have already, which are, I don't have them up in front of me, but I think that they're really based on accessibility and socioeconomic equity. So if you have a particular effort that you would be willing to write a case study on for the equity framework, we would not only welcome that, we would encourage you to please submit one, because we would love to have the most well-rounded framework and press book as possible.
And our case studies aren't on our website yet. They'll be obviously in the Pressbooks publication, but we should in the next few weeks have the 3 case studies that we have. But what is linkable right now on the doers website or for the equity projects are the guidelines for submitting a case study. And we're really quite open. In some ways, we'd love something super creative as well in terms of what people submit and how people submit. We're discovering some unknown family relationships. I love that. It's good. Other questions, reactions, comments?
I don't know if anyone's going to be leaving soon or has already left. I'm going to just share in our evaluation in the chat if everybody could take time to fill it out. And we will be posting the recordings. They'll come later on in an email.
Well, should we thank everybody for coming? Do we end early, Ruth and Lauren?
So a few more other questions that are coming through. Is there a comment on the OER process, progress and hiring practices? Are you aware of any institutions including competency and job wording?
I believe there is actually, and there's also, I do encourage you to, let me just take a look. We have so many dimensions here. We talk about just sort of wanting to have diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, an expression of commitment to inclusive pedagogy made by faculty and departments. We talk about professional development. I think we talk about, I know we talk about hiring, and it might be in multiple places, including, for example, in the what the administrative leadership roles might be for how you bring this in. But yeah, and the other thing that we mentioned was this sort of OER matrix, faculty or contributions to tenure and promotion through OER. And I'm trying to think, Anne, if that actually has some attention there either.
You know, I don't recall it there, but I know that we talked about it in putting together the rubric, because that's always been on my mind. You know, I believe that every library should have an OER librarian, and I believe that it could be in, you know, I think that other job titles, particularly in centers for teaching and learning and those kinds of things, you know, it should be in the job descriptions as we go forward. In fact, I was talking today to my new library boss, and we were saying, yeah, we need to have a permanent OER librarian in every single library, you know. So if we've neglected that, we're going to take a look at it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's implicit and not explicit. And we do talk about sort of what kind of staff support is needed, but we focus more on sort of roles. So I appreciate the comment, actually. I think that's something a bit under-attended to in the rubric. It's implicit, as I said, but not explicit.
Yeah, and it should be for sure.
So then there's, when do we expect the press book to be published? And that is in process.
I have no idea how long it takes.
We met last week about it.
We haven't done enough. I mean, I think we haven't even given them all the content yet. Again, most of this, the actual blueprint foundational document is on our website, as is the rubric, and they're downloadable. It's the case studies aren't quite up yet, but we will combine it all into press books as an additional way to kind of disseminate. So.
Yeah, and when the press books is ready, we'll blast it out through the listservs, through Twitter, through, you know, all of our channels.
Then let's see here. Where do we see library folks fitting into the rubric? For example, would we be considered practitioners, even though we're not teaching courses?
Yeah, that's you know, I think that was my neglect, not being about libraries.
But I think we do talk about libraries. We talk about, I mean, in some ways, at least in our libraries, you know, the librarians are often responsible for creating OER content. So I think we sort of address that piece of it. We talk about who has responsibility. We talk about various kinds of library roles in terms of infrastructure and staff support. So, but we do sort of, I don't want to say lump you all together, but we do sort of include librarians as parts of additional sort of both practitioner infrastructure kinds of support that are needed. So
I think that we were also intentional with the wording choice by using practitioner as opposed to instructor, faculty, librarian, and then using, you know, the term leadership specifically versus, you know, administration, because we do understand that this work is being done at multiple levels. And so using words that were, or terms that were more encompassing of the various levels. A practitioner could be a faculty member. It could also be a student. And it could also be, you know, an administrator. So I think that it's really institution dependent, even department dependent in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, we have within my system, we have very large universities with major really research libraries, but also very strong, as I said, sort of student success focused libraries, but we also have some that are tiny. So you're talking about two-person staff who are, will take on, because of their sort of commitment and dedication, they'll become a sort of OER librarian without having that title. They'll also be responsible for state mandated course markings in ways that have to be manual. I know this is something that Doers as a collaborative wants to sort of focus more closely on. And we have some new legislation that was sort of, it's wonderful in Texas, but people are freaking out about how they're going to actually implement it and fulfill what the law requires moving forward, just because of that staff support. And we know that a lot of this will fall on the librarians.
So we have a few other types of questions. Recommendations for aligning this rubric with achieving the dream work. I think that's a fantastic next step, or a phase 2, personally.
We've learned a lot from that project. So I don't know if maybe we should sort of think about, in terms of the pilot project, reaching out to ATD.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea. Had not occurred to me before, but yeah, they are definitely our friends and would like to, help us continue this work.
Yeah. Also, information such as pre-surveys regarding OER with student responses be useful to this work. Institutions have conducted those. If that information would be useful for us.
So I would love to see a case study on what you've learned from those surveying. To me, that's you're doing the qualitative assessment with that. Again, it's the kind of thing we know we all want to be doing if we aren't, or need to be doing. So to have a case study on that, to sort of talk about even just how you're doing it, even if it's early days and you don't have you can't tell the impact of the work yet. We're looking for emerging projects to be featured in our case studies, as well as more established projects with data. So I'd love to see that. Do reach out.
And then this last one here, there's quite a few thank yous. And then there's also, do you have a suggestion for where we could direct instructors interested in ideas for incorporating DEI into their course design beyond just using an open textbook or other OER? Which is a great question.
It is a great question. But I'm looking at, so the Tacoma seems to have some, it sounds like many of you have these resources. There's a very nice, the Peralta Community College has an equity rubric that I think is focused on content, as I recall, and has a very good sort of ability focus, in particular accessible content in terms of ability. But
Colorado Department of Higher Ed has a really great one too, and I will locate that into the chat.
Yeah, that's great. And also, actually, so you're talking about just beyond OER. I would say you might also look at the Center for Urban Education at the University of Southern California. One of the giants in terms of our understanding around equity is Estela Mara Ben Simone, who I think is mostly retired, but knowing her, totally active still. But she has done some phenomenal work in thinking through how you incorporate DEI ideas. There's also at the USC, there's the Pullius Center for Higher Education, and there's a new publication they have around sort of equity-centered design practices for faculty and staff, and I think it's focused not just on pedagogy but other things as well. That's Adriana Kazar is the author with some other colleagues at USC. And then the last resource I would point to is, I think AAC&U might have some, the Association of Colleges and Universities have a lot of great materials around inclusive excellence. Again, sort of thinking broadly across institutions. That too has been foundational for the work we've done in this project. So yeah.
I put those links in for you. Right.
I'm gonna look at that. And thanks for the article link. Thank you.
Are OER principles applicable to other institutions and organizations?
What do you think? I say yes. I say absolutely yes.
I would say based on the broad spectrum of participants that we've had, the answer is also yes. You know, there is almost 200 people here today, and that shows that yes, absolutely. OER spans institutions and organizations because it's not just institutions who are doing this work.
Yeah, one of the things we've done multiple presentations even before we had a rubric to share on this topic, and what we just noticed is that hunger that's out there, and I think it's represented by those of you who decided to participate today, and the other programming that ACLR is doing, ACRL is doing, and so I think this is it just speaks to that hunger that we all have. We want to be doing more. We know we've been sort of working hard without the results we want. We know that the last year and a half is just exposed in ways that we shouldn't be shocked at, but we have been shocked at, just the disparities in outcomes and access and opportunity across not just the educational sector, but health and everything, every element of sort of American society, where we don't do well by certain people at all, and haven't for decades, well, centuries really. But I'm grateful for some of these links that people are putting in. Thank you.
Well, are there any last questions? Okay. Well, I think then that we are about done. Thank you, Ann and Rebecca. We appreciate you very much.
Thank you for
You all, it's been great. Thank you, Brittany, and everyone at